You think you've seen political fireworks before, but what happened that night was unlike anything America expected. The lights were blinding, the stage was alive with anticipation, and every seat in the studio was filled. This wasn't a routine debate. This wasn't the usual back and forth that slips into background noise. This was live, raw, and dangerous. Everyone watching knew something was about to break open, but no one knew just how explosive it would become. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the center table. Sharp but simple in her appearance, she radiated a calm confidence that didn't need flashy gestures or dramatic tones. Her voice, smooth and deliberate, had that rare quality both reassuring and commanding at the same time. She wasn't reading lines. She wasn't grandstanding. She was speaking to people as if she knew their struggles, as if she'd walked into their living rooms and pulled up a chair. At first, the atmosphere in the studio felt almost peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you lean in and actually listen. Crockett laid out the stakes of a new bill being pushed forward, explaining in plain language what it meant for everyday families. She spoke of rising costs, of paychecks that don't stretch far enough, of policies that sound good on paper but crush working people in reality. She explained each point step by step, like a teacher breaking down a complicated lesson, making the impossible suddenly feel simple. And the audience listened. They didn't just hear her words, they absorbed them. Some nodded in agreement, some scribbled notes, some stared with quiet focus. It was the calm before the storm, and the storm came fast. Without warning, Donald Trump leaned forward from his chair at the far end of the table. His movement was sharp, almost startling, the kind of sudden shift that makes everyone else freeze. Even the host's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Then, in that booming tone that had dominated countless rallies, Trump cut across Jasmine's words like a thunderclap. His interruption was blunt, dismissive, and it landed like a slap in the middle of her sentence. The air in the studio snapped. You could feel it, the collective intake of breath, the shifting of bodies in their seats, the uneasy silence that follows a blow no one saw coming. The camera operator hesitated, torn between zooming in or cutting wide, but the lens stayed locked on the table, capturing every flicker of expression. Trump's voice thundered again, louder this time. He wasn't asking a question. He wasn't offering counterpoints. He was making an accusation, one meant to silence, meant to diminish, meant to derail the woman who sat calmly before him. His words were so bold, so brash, that the audience didn't know whether to gasp or to wait for the inevitable fallout. This wasn't politics anymore. This was personal. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not once. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't frown, didn't even twitch. Instead, she turned her head slowly, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. That silence spoke louder than any shout. It made the weight of Trump's interruption sit on the table like a lead brick, impossible to ignore. The seconds stretched long, every viewer at home holding their breath, every person in the studio locked on her, waiting, wondering, needing to know how would she respond. And that's when the real magic of Jasmine Crockett came into focus. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. She didn't try to overpower Trump with volume, because she didn't need to. She had something far stronger. She had composure. In that deliberate, measured tone, she spoke directly, calmly, with words that sliced through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "That's a serious claim, Mr. President," she said, her voice carrying across the studio without force, only precision. "Can you show proof of that right now?" The room froze. The host shifted nervously. The audience stirred in their seats. Trump blinked, just for a moment, before repeating himself, louder, harsher, pounding his hand lightly on the table as though the sound could make his words true. But still, there was no proof. Nothing but volume and repetition. The cameras cut from Trump's face to Jasmine's, back and forth, the contrast stark. On one side, bluster and noise. On the other, unshaken composure. Jasmine let the silence return, refusing to fill it with panic. She made the audience sit with the hollowness of his claim. And then she leaned forward, her eyes steady, her voice steady, her entire presence steady, and said, "You've just told millions of people something that questions my place in this country. Now prove it." The power shifted. Everyone in the room could feel it. The audience murmured, some shaking their heads, some whispering, others leaning forward as though they were about to witness history. Trump tried to wave his hand, tried to laugh it off, but the sound was forced, brittle, hollow. Jasmine didn't even blink. She wasn't arguing for herself anymore. She was standing for something larger, and the people in that room knew it. This was no longer about one interruption. This was about whether truth could withstand intimidation, whether composure could outlast chaos, whether one calm, steady voice could silence a storm. The tension was unbearable. The silence was deafening, and the whole country was watching. What happened next would turn this quiet studio clash into a national firestorm, a moment people would replay, share, debate, and remember. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She was only getting started. Trump's interruption wasn't the end of it. If anything, it was just the spark that set the entire stage on fire. The moment Jasmine pressed him for proof, he didn't back down. He leaned further into the microphone, his voice louder now, echoing across the studio like rolling thunder. He slammed his palm on the desk for emphasis, a small gesture but one that carried a jolt of aggression. "She doesn't represent you," he barked. "She's not even fit to be here." The audience gasped. A ripple of murmurs spread through the studio as if the crowd itself couldn't believe what it had just heard. The host shifted nervously, raising a hand as if to step in, but he hesitated. The camera zoomed closer, catching every twitch in Trump's expression, every steady breath from Jasmine. It was a picture of two worlds colliding, noise against calm, bluster against poise. But Trump wasn't alone. His words, his tone, his bravado, they stirred others at the table, allies who had been waiting for their chance to pile on. And sure enough, Marjorie Taylor Greene jumped into the fray. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and cutting, like a knife tearing through cloth. "She's not answering the real questions," Greene snapped, pointing toward Jasmine with a dramatic sweep of her hand. "She dodges, she hides, she plays the victim. That's not leadership. That's weakness." Her words rang out like accusations hurled in a courtroom, not designed to uncover truth but to smear, to overwhelm, to bully. The energy in the studio shifted again. Some in the audience shook their heads, some whispered to their neighbors, but many just sat in stunned silence. They could feel what was happening. It wasn't a debate anymore, it was an ambush. A coordinated strike meant to rattle Jasmine, to force her off balance before she could recover. Trump nodded at Greene's interjection, seizing the momentum. He raised his chin as if to say, "See? I'm not the only one." The MAGA faithful in the room clapped in scattered bursts, their noise bouncing around the walls, trying to drown out the clarity Jasmine had brought just moments earlier. But she still didn't move. She still didn't flinch. Jasmine sat straight in her chair, her eyes locked ahead, her expression unreadable. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side of the table, chaos, noise, accusations thrown like stones. On the other side, silence, stillness, a presence so steady it unsettled the very people trying to break her down. The host finally tried to interject, his voice uncertain. Let's keep this civil," he said, but it was useless. Greene's voice cut over his like a blade. "No, let's be real here," she pressed. "Americans are tired of excuses. They don't want to hear stories. They want results. And all we get from her is distraction." Gasps, whispers, uneasy shifting in the audience. The pile-on was real, and everyone could see it. Trump grinned, feeding on the tension. He slammed his hand again, his voice booming. "She's weak. She's not strong enough to stand here. Everyone sees it." And still Jasmine remained calm. She let their words hang in the air. She let the audience soak up every ounce of venom thrown her way. And while she said nothing, the silence became her ally. The crowd, sensing the imbalance, began to murmur louder, their eyes flicking back to her, waiting, almost begging for her to respond. But she didn't. Not yet. She understood something they didn't. In that moment, restraint was power. The longer she held her composure, the more hollow their noise became. The cameras captured it perfectly. Trump's face red with energy, Greene's eyes narrowed with intensity, their voices raised and insistent. And there sat Jasmine, steady, unshaken, waiting for the storm to blow itself out. What no one realized, not Trump, not Greene, not the MAGA supporters in the room, was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't cornered. She was calculating. Every second of silence wasn't weakness, it was the prelude to a counterattack that would sting far more than any insult thrown at her. And as the audience leaned in, desperate to see how she would respond, the trap was already closing. Because the more they tried to shout her down, the more they revealed about themselves. And when she finally opened her mouth again, it wouldn't just be an answer, it would be a turning point. Trump's words still echoed through the air when the next voice joined in, deep and deliberate, the kind of voice that carried weight beyond the walls of the studio. Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, his tone calm but piercing, like a judge delivering a verdict. He didn't shout like Trump. He didn't sneer like Green. His attack was quieter, more measured, but in some ways more dangerous. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said slowly, pausing on every syllable, "you may have passion, but passion does not equal understanding. You speak of policies, but you speak without the depth of law, without the foundation that holds this nation together." His words were careful, precise, aimed not at riling the crowd but at undercutting her credibility. He spoke like a man cloaked in authority, as though his very position meant she couldn't possibly be right. The audience shifted again. This wasn't just Trump's bluster or Green's heckling anymore. This was something heavier. To the viewers at home, it looked like the weight of the entire establishment was pressing down on Jasmine. Trump's interruptions were loud, Green's barbs were sharp, but Thomas's tone carried the authority of the highest court in the land, and that made it sting differently. For a moment, the energy in the room faltered. The MAGA supporters clapped loudly, emboldened by the fact that a Supreme Court justice had joined their side. It felt like the pile-on was complete. A former president, a sitting justice, a firebrand congresswoman all attacking one woman at once. To some in the audience, it looked like the moment she would break. But Jasmine Crockett didn't break. She sat still, her eyes locked on Thomas, her hands folded on the desk, her breathing steady, her presence unshaken. The contrast between the noise around her and the calm inside her was so sharp that even the camera seemed to linger on her longer, capturing that stillness as though it were its own form of resistance. Trump seized on Thomas's words, nodding vigorously, almost smirking. "Exactly," he boomed. "She doesn't know the law. She doesn't understand the Constitution. She's not qualified to speak on this stage." He leaned back in his chair with a look of satisfaction, as if Thomas had sealed the case against her. Green chimed in again, her voice high-pitched and relentless. "She's out of her depth. She's drowning in details she doesn't even grasp. This is what happens when you put someone in power who doesn't deserve it." She gestured wildly, her words layered with mockery. The sound of their voices clashed in the air, overlapping, suffocating, relentless. It was no longer one interruption, no longer one insult, it was an onslaught. A storm of voices swirling around Jasmine, each trying to drown her out, each trying to push her into silence. And yet, silence was exactly where she stayed. For long seconds, Jasmine didn't speak. She let them fill the air with their noise. She let them reveal their tactics. She let them expose themselves. The audience felt the tension in their bones, the question hanging in the air. Would she respond? Could she even respond? When she finally did, her words were quiet, but they cut like steel. "Justice Thomas," she began, her voice steady, her tone respectful but unyielding, "I was raised to believe that the law belongs to every American. That understanding the Constitution isn't reserved for the few, but required of the many. You say I lack foundation. I say the foundation is right here: lived experience, hard facts, and the truth of what these policies do to real people." The audience murmured, some clapping softly, others whispering. The contrast was undeniable. Thomas had wielded the weight of authority, but Jasmine had reminded everyone that authority is not ownership. The Constitution, she was saying, does not belong to the powerful few. It belongs to all. Trump tried to interrupt again, his voice rising. "Nonsense. Total nonsense." Green waved her hands, shaking her head dramatically, but Jasmine continued unfazed. She raised her hand slightly, not in anger, not in protest, but in a gesture of clarity. "Mr. President, Congresswoman Green, Justice Thomas, you've all spoken loudly. You've spoken often. But not one of you has answered the question that matters. How does this policy help working families?" Show me the evidence. Show me the numbers. Show me the truth. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The cameras cut back to Trump. His face tightened. He started to speak, then stopped. Green tried to shout again, but the host raised a hand this time, urging her to let Jasmine finish. Even Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Jasmine leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "What I have here," she said, tapping the folder in front of her, "are financial documents, records, numbers that don't lie. While you shout at me, while you question my right to stand here, millions of Americans are wondering how they'll pay their bills next month. That's what this is about. Not your interruptions, not your insults, not your authority, but their lives." The audience erupted in applause, louder this time, rising like a wave. Some people stood. Others shouted affirmations. The noise of support drowned out the noise of attack. For the first time, the balance tilted visibly in Jasmine's favor. Trump tried to wave it off, muttering, "Fake news," his voice cracking slightly as he did. Green gestured wildly again, but her words were swallowed by the sound of clapping. Thomas leaned back, his lips pressed together, silent. And there sat Jasmine, her presence undeniable, her calm unbroken, her message clear. The ambush had failed, the mob pressure had backfired. What was meant to silence her had given her the biggest stage of the night. And as the cameras lingered on her face, the whole nation could see it. This was not a woman crumbling under the weight of power. This was a woman redefining it. What came next would push the confrontation beyond the studio walls. It wouldn't just be a debate anymore. It would become a national moment. A test of truth against noise, of unity against division, and Jasmine Crockett was about to show America exactly what side she stood on. The noise was deafening. Trump's booming interruptions, Green's high-pitched jabs, Thomas's deliberate authority. They had all taken their turns at the microphone, layering accusations and insults on top of one another like waves crashing against the shore. For a moment it seemed endless. The voices overlapped, rising and falling, creating a storm that filled every corner of the studio. Viewers at home could practically feel the tension seeping through their screens. But in the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved, unbroken. She didn't flinch at Trump's pounding hand. She didn't recoil from Green's pointed finger. She didn't shrink under Thomas's heavy words. She simply waited. Her stillness became the most striking image on the stage. While chaos swirled around her, she embodied quiet control. And slowly, very slowly, the storm began to exhaust itself. The audience noticed it first. They leaned in closer, eyes fixed on Jasmine. They weren't watching the people shouting anymore. They were watching the one who wasn't. In that silence, Crockett turned the tables without even speaking. She made the others look smaller by refusing to play their game. Seconds ticked by. Trump's words echoed and then fell flat. Green repeated herself, her voice losing its sharpness. Even Thomas leaned back, folding his hands, as though realizing that authority had less impact when met with unshakable calm. Finally, Jasmine leaned forward ever so slightly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. She let her words fall into the silence like drops of water into a still pond, each ripple spreading further than any shout could. "It's telling," she began, her tone smooth and deliberate, "that when asked for evidence, all I've been given are insults. Not one fact, not one number, not one shred of proof, only noise." The room shifted. The words cut through the heavy air with surgical precision. People in the audience murmured. Some clapped softly, others whispered to their neighbors. The cameras caught every flicker of reaction, the widening eyes, the nods of agreement, the relief on faces that had grown weary of the storm. Jasmine paused again, letting the silence return. But this time, the silence didn't belong to Trump, Green, or Thomas. It belonged to her. She controlled it. She wielded it. "You can shout at me," she continued, her voice never rising. "You can question my place. You can wave your hands and try to drown me out. But what you cannot do, what you have failed to do, is answer the one question that matters. How does this policy help the American people?" The audience erupted, clapping louder now, their voices rising in agreement. It wasn't a roar, not yet, but it was building. Trump waved his hand dismissively, muttering fake news under his breath. Green shook her head violently, trying to interject, but her words were lost in the applause. Even Thomas remained silent, his lips pressed tight, his authority suddenly less imposing. Jasmine didn't press forward immediately. She let the applause run its course, let the crowd have its moment. And when it quieted again, she leaned back slightly, her hands folded neatly on the desk, her eyes calm but unyielding. "America deserves better than noise," she said softly. "They deserve answers. They deserve truth." The line landed like a drumbeat, reverberating through the studio. The audience clapped again, louder this time, the energy rising. The camera zoomed in, capturing Trump's tightening jaw, Green's frustrated glare, Thomas's carefully blank stare. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She straightened in her chair, her presence filling the space. "What we just saw," she said, gesturing lightly toward her opponents, "is what happens when leaders can't defend their ideas. They don't bring facts. They don't bring evidence. They bring attacks. They try to make you small, so they don't have to answer the big questions." The applause grew louder. Someone in the back row shouted, "That's right!" The energy in the room had shifted completely. What began as an ambush was becoming something else entirely, a reckoning. Trump leaned forward again, his face red, his voice sharp. "You're lying. You don't know what you're talking about." He pounded the desk again, but the sound no longer carried the same weight. Green jumped in, her words tripping over his, her voice shrill. "This is all performance. She's trying to play the victim." But this time, their voices didn't dominate. They sounded like background noise, fading against the steady current of applause for Jasmine. She leaned forward once more, locking eyes with the camera as if speaking not just to the people in the room, but to the entire country. "I am not the victim here," she said, her tone calm but edged with steel. "The victims are the families who will suffer under a policy you cannot defend. The victims are the workers who will pay more while you shout louder. The victims are the people you forget when you turn a debate into an attack." The audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered across the studio, shaking the walls. For the first time that night, Trump sat back, his lips pressed tight, his usual confidence shaken. Green gestured angrily, but her words couldn't be heard over the roar. Thomas remained silent, his expression unreadable, but even his presence seemed diminished. Jasmine sat tall, unshaken, her voice still calm as she let the applause wash over her. "You can shout all you want," she said as the noise died down. "But America is listening, and they will hear the difference between noise and truth." The cameras cut from her steady face to the scattered expressions of her opponents. The contrast was undeniable. In a battle meant to overwhelm her, she had turned silence into her greatest weapon, and the whole country was watching her win. And in that moment, the ambush was over. The counterattack had begun. The applause had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett shifted in her chair. She didn't hurry. She didn't ride the wave of clapping like a performer looking for attention. She waited. She let the energy cool just enough before she reached down and slid a thin folder from beneath her notes. The studio lights caught the edge of the paper, and the camera zoomed in instinctively. For the first time all evening, her hands moved with purpose. She placed the folder on the table, opened it with care, and spread out a handful of neatly organized pages. The shuffle of paper was soft, but in the silence that followed, it sounded thunderous. Every eye in the studio locked on her, every lens focused in. Even Trump, mid-gesture, paused for a half-second to watch. "This," Jasmine began, her voice steady as ever, "is what they don't want to talk about." She tapped the first page gently with her finger. "While they raise their voices, while they wave their hands, this is what's buried under the noise. Numbers, records, documents that tell the truth about this policy and the people it will hurt." She lifted one page, holding it just high enough for the audience to see. "Right here are the projected cost increases for working families if this bill passes. Families earning under $50,000 a year will see their household costs rise by nearly 15%. 15% while corporations at the top receive new breaks and benefits." A wave of murmurs swept the room. The applause that followed was sharper now, more pointed, less polite, and more defiant. Someone in the back shouted, "Tell it!" The clapping grew, and the cameras caught faces in the crowd nodding, whispering, leaning forward with recognition. Trump's face darkened. He shook his head, waving his hand. "Those numbers are fake. he barked, trying to laugh, but the sound cracked just slightly. Green jumped in, her voice shrill. She's making it up. That's not real data. That's propaganda. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She held the paper higher. This is straight from the Congressional Budget Office. Public record. Anyone in this room can look it up. So tell me why shout over me when the truth is written in plain ink? The applause grew louder, sharper, rolling across the studio like thunder. The host leaned in, his eyes wide, clearly sensing the gravity of the moment. For once he didn't try to interrupt. He let it play out. Jasmine set the page down, sliding another forward. Here are the impacts on healthcare access. This policy strips funding from clinics that serve rural communities, the same communities many of you claim to represent. That means fewer doctors, fewer nurses, fewer places for families to turn when they're sick. Is that leadership, or is that negligence? The crowd erupted again, clapping, shouting, even stomping their feet. The energy had shifted so completely that it felt like the ground itself had tilted beneath the table. Trump leaned forward again, his voice booming, but the words were drowned out by the roar of approval from the audience. Green shook her head furiously, mouthing words the cameras didn't even bother to capture. Thomas sat stone-faced, silent, his hands folded in front of him. Jasmine didn't stop. She flipped another page, each one like a weapon sharper than any insult. And here, tax credits removed for families with children? For the single mother trying to keep food on the table? Gone. For the father working 2 jobs to keep the lights on? Gone. And you sit here questioning my right to be at this table, while refusing to answer why families should pay the price for your noise. The studio was on fire now. Applause rolled like waves, each louder than the last. The host's eyes darted from Jasmine to Trump, as if waiting for an explosion. The cameras cut between her calm, commanding presence and Trump's reddening face. Trump finally slammed his hand again. Lies. All lies. Nobody believes this. But even as he spoke, the weakness showed. His voice cracked again. His jaw tightened. The power of volume was slipping. The audience wasn't with him anymore. Jasmine leaned forward, locking her eyes on the camera lens, as though she were speaking directly to the millions watching at home. Her voice softened, but it carried further than any shout. They will tell you I don't belong. They will tell you I don't understand. They will tell you anything but the truth. And the truth is this: when the shouting stops, the numbers remain. When the insults fade, the facts stand. And the facts say this policy hurts working Americans. The room erupted again, louder than ever before. The clapping turned into cheers, the cheers into a wave of standing applause. The studio, once tense and divided, had tilted decisively. Trump threw up his hands, muttering angrily. Green shouted something unintelligible, her voice drowned completely by the crowd. Thomas remained silent, his gaze steady but his authority clearly diminished. And there sat Jasmine, calm in the eye of the storm, her papers spread before her like a shield of truth. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply let the weight of the moment speak for itself. The audience could feel it. The viewers at home could sense it. The mob that tried to overwhelm her had given her the chance to command the stage like no one else. And as the applause rolled on, one truth became undeniable. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just surviving the ambush, she was winning it. And the night was far from over. The applause from Jasmine's documents still thundered when Trump leaned forward again, his face flushed, his jaw tight, his voice booming with a kind of forced energy. She's lying, he barked, pounding his palm on the desk. These papers mean nothing. Total fraud. You people aren't buying this, are you? But the audience wasn't clapping for him. Their applause had been for her. That shift in energy rattled him, and everyone could see it. Green jumped in again, her voice slicing through the air. This is ridiculous, she snapped, pointing directly at Jasmine. Waving papers doesn't make you right. You can pull any number out of thin air. The American people are smarter than that. Her tone was shrill, desperate to reclaim control, but the words lacked weight. And then, from the side, another MAGA congressman chimed in, emboldened by the chaos. His voice was rough, impatient, dripping with disdain. She's trying to act like she's the smartest person in the room, but everyone knows she's out of her league. It became a chorus, a cacophony of overlapping interruptions. Trump's booming voice, Green's sharp tones, The congressman's mocking laugh. Even a senator in the back row leaned forward to throw in a barb about rookies not belonging on the national stage. The mob had grown louder, more chaotic, united by a single goal: bury Jasmine under their noise. But the more they spoke, the more obvious it became. They weren't arguing against her points. They were attacking her. They were circling like a pack, hoping the sheer weight of numbers would force her into silence. And yet, Jasmine didn't bend. She sat straight in her chair, her hands resting calmly on her folder. The cameras caught her steady breathing, her unshaken composure. It was as if she was waiting for them to exhaust themselves, the way a boxer lets an opponent swing wildly until they're out of breath. And then, when the noise hit its peak, she struck. "Mr. President," she said evenly, her voice calm but sharp enough to pierce through the overlapping shouts. "Congresswoman Green, Congressman, Senator, you've each had your turn. You've each raised your voices, and yet not one of you has refuted the facts on these pages." She tapped the folder lightly, the sound amplified by the microphone. The audience quieted just enough to hear her. Trump leaned forward, scowling. Green waved her hand furiously. The congressman shook his head, but Jasmine didn't pause. She continued, her tone steady, controlled, deliberate. "Mr. President, you call these numbers fake, then show us the real ones. You had 4 years in office and access to every economic report in the nation. Where are your numbers? Where is your proof?" The audience erupted again. The applause wasn't polite anymore. It was charged, defiant, directed at Trump like a challenge. His mouth opened, but no numbers came out. He waved his hand dismissively and muttered, "Everybody knows the truth." But the weakness was clear. Jasmine turned her gaze toward Green next. "Congresswoman, you say I'm pulling numbers from thin air. But these figures are from the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, public record, available to every American who wants to see them. Are you calling the CBO a liar? Or are you hoping that shouting louder will make people forget they can check for themselves?" The audience roared again, clapping, cheering, some even laughing at Green's stunned expression. She opened her mouth to fire back, but the noise of the crowd swallowed her words. For the first time, she looked rattled. Then Jasmine shifted her focus to the congressman who had mocked her as out of her league. Her tone sharpened just slightly, her voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable edge. "You say I don't belong, but I belong here the same way every elected official does because the people sent me, and I stand here with facts, not insults. Tell me, Congressman, what have you offered tonight other than mockery? Where's your data? Where's your defense of this policy? Or is bullying easier than telling the truth?" The audience erupted again, louder than before. People stood, clapping, shouting words of support. The congressman sat back, his smirk fading. He had no answer. Jasmine turned last toward the senator, her tone soft but cutting. "And Senator, you question whether I belong on this stage. But belonging isn't measured by years in office. It's measured by whether you stand for the people who elected you. If experience means ignoring the struggles of working families, then I'll gladly remain inexperienced. Because experience without compassion is just another word for corruption." The studio exploded. Applause thundered, cheers rang out. The audience surged to its feet. The energy was no longer a battle. It was a landslide. Trump slammed the table again, his voice rising, trying to shout over the noise. "She's twisting everything. She's making this up. Don't believe her." But his words were lost, drowned under the roar of clapping and shouting. Green tried again, but even her piercing tone couldn't cut through. The mob that had tried to bury Jasmine with noise was now buried themselves under the sound of a crowd that had turned completely against them. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat tall, her hands folded on her documents, her eyes calm and unshaken. She let the applause wash over her, not as a performance, but as a confirmation. When the noise quieted, she leaned forward one last time, speaking directly into the microphone. "This is what happens when leaders can't defend their policies. They insult, they mock, they shout. But America deserves better than noise. They deserve answers. And tonight the answers are here." She tapped the folder once more. The audience roared again, louder than ever before. The camera zoomed in on her face, steady and composed, while the opposition sat scattered, red-faced, frustrated, and powerless. The ambush had failed. The mob had crumbled. And Jasmine Crockett had begun dismantling them piece by piece, leaving the entire nation watching in awe. The roar of the audience was still reverberating when the moment began to outgrow the studio. It wasn't just the crowd on their feet now. It wasn't just the clash between Crockett and the MAGA chorus echoing inside those four walls. The story was already leaking into the bloodstream of the nation. Producers in the back scrambled on headsets, whispering urgently to anchors waiting at their desks. Social media feeds lit up, hashtags surging faster than anyone could track. Clips from the exchange flashed across screens in real time, a dozen phones in the audience held high, broadcasting live to thousands who weren't even in the room. The cameras never cut away from Jasmine, but the ripple effect was undeniable. What began as a debate was transforming into a national spectacle. CNN cut in with a chyron before the segment even ended. Crockett versus Trump. Heated exchange turns explosive. On Fox, a panel scrambled to spin the moment, their voices overlapping as they tried to minimize her calm dominance. MSNBC looped the footage, their analysts nodding with visible awe. Every network, every feed, every platform, suddenly they were all locked on the same clip. Back in the studio, Trump tried to seize back control. He gestured wildly at the cameras, his voice rising, insisting that the fake news media was twisting everything. But his timing betrayed him. His words collided with the steady applause still rolling through the room. His anger looked desperate. The more he shouted, the smaller he seemed against the backdrop of Jasmine's steady presence. Marjorie Taylor Greene tried again, leaning forward, her voice cutting sharp. The media loves her because she's one of them. They'll spin this into some victory when all she's done is wave papers and pretend. She gestured toward the cameras as though trying to claw them back, but the cameras weren't hers anymore. They belonged to Jasmine. Justice Thomas remained silent, but even his silence was noticed. Commentators online were already asking why the justice, who had spoken with such authority minutes earlier, had no answer when confronted with hard data. The questions began piling up, not about Jasmine's credibility but about theirs. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't raise her hands in triumph. She simply leaned forward again, her voice calm but carrying the full weight of the moment. "This isn't about me versus you," she said evenly. "This is about what America deserves. And right now, they deserve leaders who can answer questions, not avoid them. They deserve policies that help, not harm. And they deserve the truth, even when it's inconvenient." The applause returned, louder than before, but this time it wasn't just applause. It was recognition. Viewers at home felt it too. Seniors sitting in living rooms, workers watching on their phones during late shifts, students scrolling in dorm rooms, they all saw the same thing. A woman standing steady against a storm, refusing to bend, refusing to break, and in doing so exposing the weakness of those trying to bury her. News tickers scrolled updates every few seconds. Crockett challenges Trump directly. Audience cheers as debate turns fiery. Lawmakers pile on. Crockett holds ground. The clip was already viral before the segment even ended, retweeted by celebrities, reposted by activists, dissected by analysts. The debate wasn't a local moment anymore. It was a national flashpoint. Trump saw it. His face reddened as he pointed toward the cameras. "Don't believe what you're seeing," he shouted. "It's all spin. She's lying. They're lying. It's fake." His voice cracked again, and the host glanced uneasily toward him, clearly sensing the unraveling. Greene muttered furiously to the person next to her, her words lost under the roar of the crowd. Thomas adjusted his glasses but still said nothing. Jasmine stayed calm. She looked straight into the camera, her voice steady, her words deliberate. "America can decide for themselves," she said. "They don't need me to tell them what they just saw. They don't need him to tell them either. They saw the truth unfold in front of their eyes, and no amount of shouting will erase it." The room exploded again. Standing, ovation, cheering, clapping, the sound so loud that even the microphone struggled to contain it. Outside the studio, networks cut back to anchors shaking their heads in disbelief. Analysts pointing out that in just a few minutes, Jasmine Crockett had flipped an ambush into a defining moment. The mob had tried to silence her. Instead, they had handed her the spotlight. And now, with the whole country watching, the confrontation was no longer confined to one stage. It had become a story of power, resistance, and truth that was about to ripple far beyond the cameras, far beyond the studio, and deep into the American conversation. The question wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett had survived the ambush. The question now was how far her words would travel and how many millions would echo them by the next morning. The roar of the studio hadn't even calmed when Jasmine leaned forward again, her voice carrying above the fading applause, not with force but with precision. She had the floor now, and she knew it. The cameras were hers, the crowd was hers, and the story already belonged to her. America saw what just happened, she said, steady and deliberate. They saw a president, a congresswoman, a justice, and others spend 10 minutes shouting at me, and not one of them showed a single fact to defend this policy. They had their chance, they had the floor, and all they offered was noise. The audience stirred again, clapping, whistling, some even shouting her name. The host sat back, realizing his role had shifted. He wasn't moderating anymore. He was witnessing. The cameras panned to Trump, his lips pressed tight, his face red. Green was shaking her head furiously, trying to cut in, but the crowd drowned her out. Thomas's silence was becoming its own statement, a reminder that sometimes authority falters in the face of truth. Jasmine lifted another sheet from her folder, holding it just high enough for the lights to catch it. "This is what leadership looks like," she said. "Not yelling, not mocking, not tearing people down. Leadership means answers. Leadership means evidence. Leadership means standing up for the families who will feel the impact of every bill passed in this building." The crowd erupted again. The chant began in one corner, soft at first, then louder, then spreading until the whole room pulsed with it. "Answers, not noise! Answers, not noise!" The rhythm filled the air like a drumbeat, echoing into every microphone, every broadcast, every feed across the country. Trump slammed his hand on the desk again, shouting over the chant, "She's lying! Don't listen to her!" But the timing betrayed him. The chant only grew louder, drowning him out. Green tried to lean into her microphone, shouting, "This is all theater!" But her voice was thin against the wave of sound. The mob that had once seemed so powerful now looked scattered, desperate, shrinking with every second. Jasmine didn't raise her hand to quiet the chant. She let it roll for a full minute, filling the studio, filling the broadcast. She let America hear what it sounded like when truth hit home. And then, when the chant naturally died down, she leaned in once more, her tone calm but sharpened to a point. "Mr. President," she said, her eyes locked on Trump, "you've called me weak. You've called me unfit. You've said I don't belong. But America just saw what happens when power relies on volume instead of facts. Power loses, because the truth doesn't need to shout." The applause exploded again, louder than ever. The cameras caught Trump gesturing angrily, Green mouthing protests, the congressman from earlier shaking his head with his lips pressed tight. But the images told the story better than any words. They looked small, while Jasmine looked unshaken, in command. And outside the studio, the reaction was multiplying. Clips flooded social media, hashtags trending, millions of views piling up within minutes. Headlines scrolled across screens. Crockett flips the script. Mob fails. Crockett rises. The calm that shook the stage. On cable news, anchors replayed her lines, pausing after her quote about leadership, calling it the moment of the night. Back in the room, Jasmine kept going, her voice now speaking directly to the camera. "This is bigger than me," she said. "This is about every worker who's been told to work harder while billionaires pay less. This is about every child who's been told their future doesn't matter while their schools lose funding. This is about every American who's been shouted down, ignored, dismissed, and tonight I stand for them." The crowd stood again. Applause, shouts, cheers that felt less like an audience and more like a movement. Trump muttered something into his microphone, but the words were lost. Green folded her arms, staring daggers across the table. Thomas kept his hands folded, still silent, still unmoving. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't flinch. She didn't falter. She had seized the moment completely, transforming what began as an ambush into a national lesson. The mob had tried to drown her out. Now, they were the ones drowned out by her calm, her facts, and the undeniable roar of a crowd that had chosen its side. The cameras lingered on her face as the chant swelled again, her voice cutting through like a steady drumbeat. "America belongs to all of us. And no amount of noise will ever change that. And with those words, the room felt less like a debate hall and more like the birthplace of something far bigger than anyone had expected. By the time the studio audience sat down again, the story had already left the building. Phones buzzed across the country. Televisions in diners, airports, and living rooms switched to the live broadcast. The debate was no longer just an event, it was breaking news, spreading like wildfire across the nation. Networks scrambled to update their headlines. CNN plastered "Crockett confronts Trump, audience explodes" across the screen. MSNBC rolled continuous footage of her calm stare, side by side with Trump's red face. Even Fox News, usually quick to shield its allies, couldn't ignore the reality of the confrontation. Their banner read, "Heated exchange on policy sparks national reaction." On social media, the clip had already gone viral. Within minutes, hashtags like #Crockett vs Trump, #answers not noise, and #she belongs were trending globally. Celebrities reposted it with short captions. "Power. This is leadership." She didn't just answer, she transformed the room. Activists cut clips of her strongest lines, replaying them on TikTok and Instagram, where millions of younger viewers who hadn't even tuned in now watched in disbelief. Back in the studio, the MAGA figures realized the tide had shifted. Green tried again, her voice shrill, pointing toward the cameras. "See? The media's spinning this. They'll make her the hero." But her protest sounded like an admission, a recognition that the cameras were no longer theirs. Trump shook his head furiously, muttering into his microphone, "This is fake, totally fake." But the more he denied, the weaker it looked. Justice Thomas remained silent, his expression unreadable. Commentators across the country were already asking why a Supreme Court justice would insert himself into a shouting match and then retreat when the facts appeared. His silence spoke volumes, and the headlines were unforgiving. Jasmine didn't chase the noise. She didn't argue with Green's protests or Trump's muttering. She stayed locked in, her voice steady as she addressed not just the room but the entire country. "The American people deserve answers," she said again, leaning forward. "Not volume, not intimidation, not empty words. They deserve leaders who will stand in front of them with facts, not fear." The studio exploded in applause again, but this time the cameras captured more than just clapping. They caught tears on the faces of some audience members, nods of approval, people whispering to each other as though they knew they had just witnessed a turning point. Anchors replayed that line on loop. Analysts dissected it. Editorial writers began drafting columns before the night was even over. Jasmine had shifted the narrative, from being the one under attack to being the one defining the moment. Even the White House press corps caught on. Journalists tweeted out live reactions, framing the clash as a defining confrontation about truth, leadership, and the soul of American democracy. By dawn, newspapers would have front-page spreads with Jasmine's image, her folder of documents. Her calm composure contrasted against the chaos that tried to overwhelm her. In the room, the MAGA figures could sense it. Trump's gestures grew bigger, his voice harsher, but it felt less like dominance and more like desperation. Green leaned into her mic again, but the words slipped away, drowned out by the crowd's energy. The congressman from earlier sat back, his smirk gone. The senator folded his arms, staring at the floor. Jasmine, meanwhile, grew stronger with each minute. Her pauses carried more weight than their interruptions. Her words sliced through the noise with clarity. She didn't just respond, she dismantled. She didn't just defend, she led. And America saw it. The clash was no longer about one policy. It was about the contrast between chaos and composure, between bluster and truth. The mob had tried to bury her under noise. Instead, they had buried themselves under the weight of her silence, her facts, and the undeniable support of a nation ready for someone who could stand firm in the storm. As the segment drew toward its end, the feeling was unmistakable. The night didn't belong to Trump, or Green, or Thomas. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett, and the whole country knew it. The room was electric, every second heavier than the last. The clash had already gone national, but inside the studio, the tension was reaching its breaking point. Trump's voice grew louder, his gestures wider, but the desperation was obvious. Green leaned into her microphone again, her words tripping over themselves as she tried to cut through the applause, but the audience barely paid attention. Even Justice Thomas sat back in silence, his once measured authority now swallowed by the momentum that Jasmine had built. Jasmine leaned forward, her hands resting calmly on the stack of papers in front of her. The camera zoomed in, catching the steadiness in her eyes. She didn't have to fight for attention anymore. The stage was hers. The noise had burned itself out, leaving only her voice, clear and deliberate. "Tonight," she began, her tone steady but carrying weight, "America has watched what happens when leaders are asked to provide answers. They've seen shouting, they've seen mockery, they've seen power used not to protect, but to intimidate. And they've also seen the truth documents, numbers, facts that speak louder than insults ever could." The crowd stirred again, applause starting low and rising like a wave. She lifted one page from her folder and held it high. "This is the reality families live with. Not politics, not theater reality. Rising costs, shrinking opportunities, children left behind. That's what we're debating. And if this stage has shown anything tonight, it's that noise cannot erase reality." Trump slammed his hand against the table. "Lies! All lies!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the roar of applause. Green threw up her arms, her words drowned before they left her mouth. The senator in the back leaned forward, but even he couldn't break through the sound of the crowd, which was now chanting again, "Answers, not noise! Answers, not noise!" Jasmine didn't raise her voice over the chant. She waited. She let it roll, let it build, let the cameras capture every second of it. And then, when the chant softened enough for her words to cut through, she leaned closer to the microphone. "America doesn't belong to one man. It doesn't belong to one family. It doesn't belong to one party. It belongs to all of us." She paused, the silence deliberate, her gaze steady on the lens. "And no president, no justice, no politician has the right to tell us who counts as American and who doesn't." The room erupted. This wasn't applause anymore, it was an explosion. People leapt from their seats, clapping, shouting, stomping, the sound rolling through the studio like thunder. The cameras cut to Trump, his lips pressed tight, his face red, his hand gripping the table. Green shook her head furiously, mouthing protests that were lost in the roar. Thomas sat frozen, his silence louder than words. The host, who had barely spoken in minutes, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with disbelief at the scene unfolding. The crew behind the cameras stood still, some even clapping along with the audience. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was history in motion. Jasmine sat back slowly, her expression calm, her hands folding once more on the table. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She let the noise fill the air, knowing that she had already said what needed to be said. The applause wasn't for her alone. It was for the message she carried, the truth she held steady in the face of chaos. For the first time that night, Trump didn't try to interrupt. He didn't try to overtalk her. He sat in silence, his shoulders tight, his eyes fixed on the desk. The cameras lingered on him for a beat, then shifted back to Jasmine, composed, resolute, unshaken. The clash had begun with an interruption. It ended with her voice echoing above the roar of a standing ovation. And as the broadcast drew to a close, the story was clear. Jasmine Crockett had walked into an ambush and walked out the victor, not by shouting louder, but by standing taller. The cameras faded to black, but the moment was far from over. The applause still echoed in the ears of millions who had watched live, and within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance began flooding every platform. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, every feed was alive with the same image. One woman standing steady while the most powerful voices in the room tried and failed to break her. By dawn, her words were everywhere. "America doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to all of us." The line was replayed again and again, written in headlines, shared in captions, etched into the national memory. Newspapers carried her photo across their front pages. Opinion writers declared it the defining moment of the year. Pundits on cable news marveled at how she turned an ambush into a masterclass on composure. Even her critics, forced to respond, couldn't ignore the fact that she had owned the night. In homes across the country, families talked about what they had seen. Seniors who had lived through decades of politics said they had never witnessed such poise under pressure. Young people posted that they finally felt represented, that someone was willing to stare down chaos without losing control. Parents told their kids, "That's what strength looks like. That's what leadership sounds like." Meanwhile, the MAGA chorus scrambled. Trump's team released statements calling it fake. Green went live on social media to rant about media bias, and others tried to spin the narrative. But the more they denied, the more they looked like they were running from the truth. Clips of their shouting, contrasted with Jasmine's silence, only reinforced the imbalance. The mob had wanted to bury her. Instead, they had buried themselves. And Jasmine never gloated. She never lashed out. In interviews the next morning, her tone was the same as it had been on stage. Calm, focused, steady. "I didn't come here to win a fight," she told reporters. "I came here to tell the truth. The American people deserve answers. They deserve leadership rooted in reality, not in volume." Her words echoed the very sentiment that had carried her through the storm. Analysts called it a turning point not just for her, but for the way Americans understood leadership. They drew comparisons to historic confrontations where one voice, calm and unyielding, shifted the conversation of an entire nation. Commentators said that what set Jasmine apart wasn't just her facts, but her refusal to be dragged into the mud. She didn't beat noise with more noise. She beat it with clarity. And in that, she reminded people of something they had forgotten: that truth, spoken plainly, has power. The emotional weight carried into living rooms everywhere. People who had been told they didn't belong, who had been shouted down, dismissed, or ignored, saw themselves in her. For once, they didn't just see a politician, they saw a mirror of their own struggle. And in her victory, they felt their own. The backlash from her opponents only made the resonance stronger. The louder they protested, the more hollow they sounded. The more they denied, the more the evidence of her composure shined. By the end of the week, polls showed a surge in her recognition nationwide. Comment sections under every clip overflowed with messages like, "I've never felt prouder," and "Finally, someone stood tall." But the real victory wasn't political. It was human. It was cultural. It was emotional. Because the message that lingered wasn't about Trump or Green or Thomas. It wasn't about documents or budgets. It was about belonging. It was about the fundamental truth Jasmine had laid bare in front of millions, that America is not the property of the loudest voice in the room. It is not defined by those who shout others down. It is not narrowed to one color, one class, one group, or one family. It belongs to everyone. That was the message that carried. That was the line people repeated at kitchen tables, in classrooms, at work. America belongs to all of us. And it's why the moment didn't end when the broadcast did. It grew, it spread, it inspired. People who had been silent began to speak. Those who had been weary felt a spark of energy. Leaders across the country echoed her words. Teachers played the clip in civics classes. Pastors quoted her in sermons. Community organizers put her line on posters. It became more than a debate, it became a declaration. In the weeks that followed, as the noise of politics churned on, that single truth remained. Every time someone tried to dismiss it, the video replayed. Every time a critic sneered, another clip went viral. Jasmine's composure had become proof. Her calm had become strength. Her words had become a rallying cry. And that is why, when people look back at that night, they won't remember the shouting. They won't remember the insults. They won't even remember the pounding fists or the angry gestures. They will remember the silence that became power, the calm that turned into thunder, the truth that cut through the storm. They will remember Jasmine Crockett sitting steady, staring into the camera, and saying words that reminded a nation of its promise. America doesn't belong to one man, it belongs to all of us. The applause may have ended, the cameras may have gone dark, but the message carried on louder, deeper, stronger than any insult ever could. And that is the story of how one voice, calm and unshaken, turned an ambush into a movement, a debate into a declaration, and a single night into a lasting reminder that truth, no matter how quietly spoken, will always rise above the noise.